Okay. Okay, some people are on. Can you let me know if the audio is working? Can you hear me? Is there audio? I don't want, hopefully don't have a mess up like last time. Good, thank you. Okay. Yankee Apple from Michigan. Good, okay. So we're okay. I'm not going to mess with anything. I'm just going to run with what we've got. Okay, great. No, Brazil. Hello. Colorado. Okay, we're getting people checking in. Another 10 minutes and we'll start. A beautiful day here, sunny and warm, not too hot. Greetings. We're still a few minutes from starting. Yes, it looks like we're okay. We have somebody coming 1st of September, and we've got one person already who's going to be staying on a little bit longer. But I think we're going to be fine. Idea for a talk: how to maintain sati and samadhi into the insane, stressful work environment. Yeah, that could be a possibility. That mind. Yeah, that is good news. It worked out well. I sent a request to a few different places, and we got a number of people expressing interest. Good day. Less than 5 minutes, we'll start right in the dot of 6 EST. Yeah, things are good in Thunder Bay. Weather's been really nice the last few days. It's cooled off a little bit. It was unbearably hot and humid. Now it's just nice. It's good. almost time, another minute and a half or so. Okay, we can start. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. So I wanted to discuss somewhat more philosophical uh, issue this evening, and that is a particular question in philosophy that's called the mind-body problem, which is the relationship between mind and body, and how do the Buddhists look on this this particular question. I think we can begin by reviewing what the Buddha said about the right view, the middle path, and the two extreme views. And we find this in several places in the suttas, but probably most extensively discussed in the Brahmajala Sutta, Digha Nikaya number 1, where the Buddha goes through, excuse me, goes through a long list of philosophical positions that he rejects as being wrong view. And there's 61 of them, but they're all variations basically on two themes. There is the Sasatawada, the eternalist view, and the Uchedawada, the annihilationist view. The eternalist view, the Sasatawada, is the view that human beings are possessed of an eternal spirit, soul, Atman, Jiva, whatever your particular group, whatever terminology they use. But there is the idea that there's some unchanging principle in the human being and in all beings. And this is called the eternalist view. And it usually goes along with in most variants, it goes along with the idea of a creator God. He's like the big self, the big soul who started everything. The opposite extreme view is the Uchedawada, the annihilationist view. It literally means the cutting off view, because the defining characteristic of this view, which is we would call in modern terminology materialism or physicalism, the defining characteristic of this view is that the living being is cut off at death. Once the body dissolves, there is no continuation of any sort. Now, these two views are still very common in different forms in the world today, as they were in India, and they are very much opponents. And you can see, for example, the endless debate between creationists and evolutionists as the expression of this dichotomy of view. And I think most people who don't look into the matter too deeply would think that these two positions cover all possible bases. But the Buddha taught a middle path based on the Paticca Samuppada, the dependent origination, that rejects both of the extreme views. Because although both of these seem self-evidently opposite and as far apart as you can get, they do share one characteristic that makes them invalid from the Buddhist philosophical position, and that is a reliance in the end on randomness or arbitrariness. So a denial of causality. It seems to be one of the foundation stones of Buddhist thought through the ages, has been a strong reliance on the idea of causality, that things arise due to causes and conditions. There is no random arising, and there is no arbitrary will of a creator. Everything that exists because it has a prior cause. And this extension of this is the principle of beginninglessness, that there never was a first beginning of samsara. Because whatever moment in time you look at, you call it time zero, there has to be a time 0 minus 1 to have caused time 0. And you can extend that infinitely back. So there's no first cause, which is a kind of a fantastic insertion into the sequence. You have trouble explaining the sequence, so you just add in this idea of a first cause. So the Buddhist view, that's the first point to make, is that the Buddhist view is neither eternalist nor annihilationist. And when we look at this question of what is mind and what is body or matter, we can also see that the two extreme views both tend to a materialist bias in a different way. The materialist or annihilationist view is obviously materialist or physicalist. The underlying idea is that human beings are machines made out of meat, and that mind is just a byproduct of actions within the body. In the modern variant, it would be neurons firing in the brain. Whereas the eternalist view is usually formulated as what's called substance dualism, meaning that there is body and there is mind, and they're two different substances. So this ends up being a kind of materialist view as well, of a somewhat subtler nature, in that there is in this view, there is a soul or a spirit that, while not material in the same sense as a rock or a piece of wood, is as a substance, it's a thing. If we look at the Buddhist position from, let's say, from the angle of Abhidharma. In Abhidharma, there are 4 categories that are considered ontological primitives, meaning that they are realities that cannot be explained one in terms of the other. They're where analysis ends. They have their own laws and their own way of being, not dependent on the other categories. And these are kaya, or rupa, physical matter, chitta, which is consciousness, Cutasaka, mental objects, and nibbana as outside the other 3. So clearly in this categorization, chitta is seen as not the same as, or not dependent on, kaya or matter. It has its own reality. And we can see in the broader Buddhist teachings that there are some aspects that make it evident that the understanding in Buddhism is that the mind is not completely dependent on the body. It's not generated by the body. It has its own existence, as it were. And 2 instances of this. One is rebirth. If there's a causal sequence that continues from one life to another, there's obviously no physical linking. And the Buddha specifically denied that there was any consciousness that moved from one body to the other. So this is denial of substance dualism. But there is a linking of causality, of cause and effect. The other indication that we can think about mind without reference to body is in the cosmology, the existence of, want to take that literally or not, I don't think it's necessary. I don't see any reason to reject it outright, but there's no reason, you don't necessarily have to accept that, but it is significant that the ancient Buddhists conceptualized that there could be a realm of existence without any relation to physical form. So mind existing and processing data in its own sphere without any physical base. And I think one of the problems in thinking about this is that people have difficulty conceptualizing something that might exist that is completely non-physical. They tend to want to see it as some kind of subtle matter. You know? And this is even not just a modern problem. Some of the questions about the formless realm in the Katawatu point to this, that there were people at the time who said, well, there cannot really be a formless existence. They must have some kind of subtle form. But this is refuted by the Theravada opponent in this debate. And it becomes clear looking at the idea of the formless realm that being separated or being non-physical means that it has no location. It cannot be said to be here, there, everywhere, or anywhere, or nowhere. This is, space is a product of the rupakanda, physical form, and mind has no reference to that. Mind not connected to a body is outside of space. It has nothing to do with space. So it's non-local in modern terminology. So we need to think of mind as a process or a happening, a verb rather than a noun. And this is one reason why we have difficulty conceptualizing that, is because of the trap of our language. And it doesn't matter what language you're using, whether it's English or Pali or any other language. Um, the rules of the universal grammar require that we have nouns for things like mind, consciousness, perception, feeling. These are referenced by nouns. But so this sets up an implicit bias into thinking of them as things, where really they're not any substance at all. They're just action. They're just a process without any, without necessarily any medium. Then looking at the other side of the problem, what is matter, what is form? This isn't such an easy question to answer either. We used to think we knew what matter was, and then it became more and more vague and abstract and difficult to pin down. You know, what is external reality without the relationship to mind? One answer is that it only exists as a field of potential, the wave function, and it's only when consciousness interacts with it that it actually manifests as something discrete. As at least in the Copenhagen interpretation of physics. But in any case, it's not as cut and dried as we used to think up to the 19th century that we knew what matter was. Now it's very problematic. So then, having considered at least briefly and superficially, perhaps the two sides of this, we can give some thought to exploring what exactly is the relationship. Simple to demonstrate. If I raise my hand, at first there had to be a mental impulse to do that. So the mind can affect the body. And also the body can affect the mind. If you're very tired, or if you've ingested alcohol, say, then your mind will not be as sharp and as clear as it is otherwise because of physical conditions. Because while you're in a human form, your mind and body are entangled in some mysterious way. Now, the eternalist would say that there's a soul animating the body, and the annihilationist would say that the body generates the mind. The mind is just a byproduct of the body. Buddhism does give a primacy to the mind. In the first verse of the Dhammapada, we have mind is the forerunner, mind is the chief. The body follows the mind like the cart follows the ox. So mind is the animating principle in that way. It is primary to matter, which reverses the materialist bias. In ancient times, and still I think in traditional cultures around the world, the idea was always that the heart is the seat of the mind, and it's only in relatively recent times that we've moved that idea to say the brain is the seat of the mind. It's curious that in the Visuddhimagga, there's no conception of the function of the brain has anything to do with mind. In the passage on the 32 parts of the body, when brain is described, it's said to be a species of marrow that lives in the skull of the head, in the interior of the skull. And when you have a cold or flu, it liquefies and drips out of your nose. So they had no sense of the brain had anything to do with mind. There's a passage in the Vinaya that talks about a young man who was spoiled by his parents, and they were, as he came of age to adulthood, they were trying to find him a soft, cushy job, and they went through a bunch of different careers, possibilities, and rejected them as all being too burdensome. Such as being a farmer, you'd be out in the field getting bitten by flies and hard work. You don't want to do that. And one of the possibilities they considered was an accountant, like in the royal treasury. And they said, well, if he had to think all day, his chest would hurt. So they had a very intuitive sense that the mind is located in the chest. We've decided in our culture that it's it's the brain, and the brain does have definitely processing role. And we have a good understanding now of neurobiology and how the brain works. But no one has been able to explain how consciousness occurs. This is the key issue, and it's called in the philosophy of mind the hard problem. The easy problem, or there are many easy problems, is explaining the various subsidiary processes. Like we can understand how motor impulses make the body move, and we can understand how the brain processes signals coming from the eyes and the ears and so on. But at the end of the chain, there's a knowing mind, and no one's been able to explain that. It's the difference between which is technologically possible now. We can have a computer with a camera and facial recognition software and a database of faces. And say the police are looking for a criminal. They see this face, or the computer sees this face and it runs through the database, and it identifies a match, and it displays an answer on the screen. But there's still no subjective experience in the computer. If that's just happening in an empty room, then there's nobody knowing it. It's just a mechanical process running down. But if the operator comes into the room and looks at the screen and says, "Oh, okay, that's that face that belongs to Joe Smith," then there is a knowing. There's a subjective experience. One of the modern philosophers of mind has written an essay titled "What is it? What does it mean to be a bat?" or "What is it like to be a bat?" Something I can't remember the exact title, but the idea is that if we want to decide if something's conscious or not, if it has experience, we can ask, does it mean something to be that thing? Like you have a heart, because bat is such an alien creature in terms of its sense perceptions. It's hard to imagine exactly what it would be like, but we do have an intuitive sense there is something that it's like to be a bat. It has some experience. But to ask, what's it like to be a baseball bat? That makes no sense, right? The baseball bat is not conscious, and we intuit that. It doesn't make any sense to ask, what's it like to be a baseball bat? And they call this experience at the end of the chain, in terms of the philosophy of mind, modern terminology, they call it qualia. It's meaning a subjective experience. And it's very mysterious how it works. It's not, and that's why they call it the hard problem, because it can't be, or at least it has not, up to now, been explained at all in terms of physiology. And argument has been made. I've been making this argument for some time, and I've recently seen different versions of it, that it can never be explained in terms of brain function, because it's non-algorithmic. Let me explain what I mean by that. An algorithm is a set of steps that you can formulate. You can write them down to process something. So a recipe for making cookies would be a kind of algorithm. You take so much flour, so much sugar, so on, and then you do this and that to it, mix it and beat it, put it in the oven. Right? That's a kind of an algorithm. and they can be, algorithms can be in mathematics much more precise and tight and formal. And any operation of any machine of any kind has to follow an algorithm, meaning you can explain it stepwise. You can go through all the functioning parts and say this does this and that causes this to happen and that turns this wheel and so on. And then the result is you get the end result of the output of the machine. Now, consciousness, meaning just the simple act of knowing, chitta, is difficult to understand, not because it's complicated, but because it's so ultimately simple. It's so immediate. It's just there. It's just experience. Here's object of consciousness. Here's consciousness arising to the object. There's no process. It just is. It just happens. Right? And you can't even imagine formulating an algorithm that could produce consciousness. The question is actually kind of silly. You can't imagine writing out a computer program that would in the end be conscious. You know, how would you do it? How would you even start? It doesn't even make any sense, right? Because it's so immediate. There's no subsidiary steps to it. So it just occurs. It's non-algorithmic. And anything that has a physical base that arises from physicality would have to be, at least in theory, explained by an algorithm. So if mind was actually just a product of neurons firing in the brain, we should, in theory, be able to extrapolate that, explain that. And not only that, but we should be able to, once the algorithm is known, we should be able to translate that to operate on a different medium. There's no reason why it couldn't work with semiconductors or relays or anything else, if it were algorithmic. But it doesn't. It cannot be algorithmic. There have been numerous writings and philosophers dealing with the problem of mind. Not all of them are Buddhist, but there's now. It used to be very strongly dominated by the materialist side, with writers like Daniel Dennett. But there are some anti-materialists who are making a very strong case now from a Western scientific philosophical perspective. And I'd like to recommend a couple of books that I'll put the titles in the chat when we're done, so you can have if you're interested, you can get them. Particularly this The Idea of the World by Bernardo Kastrup. And you can find shorter essays by him on the internet. He is a very scientifically minded modern philosopher who proposes idealist theory of reality. Idealism is a philosophical position that only mind is real, that matter is not real. It's a position that was actually held by some schools of Buddhism. The Yogacara school of India, which their teachings still survive into as one stream that fed into Tibetan Buddhism. The Yogacara school held that only mind is real. And we're essentially living in a dream. And the reason why we share experience with each other is because we've intermingled our karma for so long, we're dreaming together. But only mind is real. Now that's an interesting philosophical position, and this book by Kastrup, he takes a modern argument for that position that's actually quite strong. One of the points he makes, it's not the only point, but one of the points he makes is that if you take a materialist view that mind is derivative from matter, you're actually taking an abstract position, because the only thing you ever experience directly is your own mind. So that's the only thing we know for certain as a starting point is mind. And we only extrapolate the idea of matter because of certain experiences that are known through the mind. So it kind of taking materialist view is taking a less natural, less obvious view, and giving reality to something that's only known at second hand, and denying the reality of that which is known at first hand, which is mind. Now, as I said, this idealist view is one that's found in some schools of Buddhism. My reading of Theravada Abhidharma is that it's not idealist. It doesn't deny the reality of matter, but sees that mind has an independent, is an independent category. It's not dependent on matter. And if we consider some statements of the Buddha, like, for example, when I say the world, loka, I mean this fathom-long body, or I mean the six senses. So the world is the body or the six senses, which is a kind of a way of saying that the external world we only know at second hand. We don't ever touch the external world with any directly. We receive signals, limited signals, through the sense organs, and then the mind processes them. But we never ever experience anything outside our own mind directly. So I don't think Theravada philosophy ever rejected the reality of an external world, but downplayed its importance, saying ultimately its ultimate nature is moot. You'll never really know it or experience it. The only thing you really have is your mind. The only thing that's really established and that you can work with and that you can know is your own mind. The external world, yeah, it's nice, but it's secondhand. We don't really get at it. It's sort of a waste of time to be too concerned about the nature of it. Um, I don't think any school of Buddhism historically has ever been materialist, although I know there are some modern people out there who are trying to uh, concoct a materialist version of Buddhism, but I don't think it works very well. But materialism has definitely become the favored intellectual position of the intellectual class. Interestingly, it's actually weakest amongst the physicists. They seem to be the most open to considering other possibilities. Um, so covered a lot of ground. Was one other aspect I want to touch on is that uh, considering the role of the brain, and I've already alluded to the fact that the ancients knew nothing about it, but now we do. We know something about the brain, and I think that the analogy of the brain to a computer is a misleading one. It's one that's kind of natural to our culture because we're so enamored of our own creations. And computer is a pretty amazing thing that runs a lot of complicated algorithms, basically. So we think of the brain as being a computer, it's running algorithms, and consciousness must be the result of some kind of algorithm, although we can't imagine what. I think, and obviously there is some connection between mind and brain. It's some kind of interface. But I would like to propose a different technological metaphor. If we need to, if we must think in terms of a technological metaphor, I would think of the brain as a radio receiver that is an interface between body and mind. If the idea in mind occurs, I want to raise my hand, then that causes specific neurons to fire in the brain that stimulate the motor nerves in the arm, contract the muscles, and cause the arm to raise. The initial impulse was purely mental, and the brain is the vehicle that the mind uses to manipulate the body. And that's a very crude, simple example, but even the brain controls the whole physical organism, the beating of the heart, the lungs, and also it processes sense data. It does many, many functions. But you have to then ask in the end, what causes the neurons, the specific neurons to fire? What's the motive underlying? Where's the signal coming from? So there's actually quite a lot more could be said about this topic. I think I'll stop and go more informally now and look at any questions. And I'll type the title of these two books I'm recommending into the chat here. Okay. So anybody have a questions or angles of this topic you'd like to explore? Is there actually a mind-body problem at all? Well, the problem may be kind of a strained word, but there is a question or an area of investigation. What is the nature of mind? What is the nature of body, and how do they relate? Um, yeah, I think that to say that they're stored in the brain, that relies on that computer analogy. That we know, for example, that they've done experiments with when people are having surgery and their brain is exposed. They can electrically stimulate a spot in the brain, and it will recall a memory. The person will recall a memory very vividly, and all this. Probably not correct. It's probably, my analogy of a radio receiver, that it tunes into the frequency of that aspect of mind that has the memory. If someone's injured and they lose part of their memory because of a head injury, it's like you can if you damage your radio, then you get some stations may not come in anymore. So we are all sharing, living the same dream. That is the Yogacara position, and that is also somewhat, I would say, Bernardo Castro's position. Uh, Question about practice here. I practice 2 hours of Anapana and 2 hours of Vipassana. Is it okay to do it? Yeah, that's fine. That sounds like a good mix. Would Sankara? That's a good question. Would Sankaras be viewed as algorithmic in some sense? Um, yeah, I don't know if all of them are, but certainly a lot of them are, because we can mimic a lot of Sankaras on a computer. Like if you sit down with a pencil and paper and work out a math problem, you're running an algorithm, right? But a computer can be programmed to solve the same problem. So that Vitaka Vichara, that mental processing, is algorithmic. And to some degree also perception. Like the example I gave of a computer with a face recognition software, it's running an algorithm that mimics perception, but there's no consciousness at the end of it. Yes, no, so good so far. Okay, I don't see any more questions coming in, so maybe we'll call it a night unless anybody has a last question to throw into the chat. Is there a difference with enlightenment and a Buddha? Um, I don't understand the question. Is there a difference from what? What do you, what are you asking about enlightenment and the Buddha? About mind body? Mind body and the Buddha? Um, well, we can't really imagine the mind state of a Buddha. We can try to reformulate the question. I'll hang on and see what if there's something more precise. It's the state of mind perception. Well, the difference with a Buddha's mind and perception is that it's not obstructed in any way or defiled. That there's no ignorance, there's no delusion, there's no attachment or aversion. So it's absolutely pure, direct consciousness and perception. So the Buddha's perception would be crystal clear. It wouldn't be confused and obstructed like ours is. Yeah, yeah, that's part of this forgetting between lifetimes is part of the nature of samsaric becoming, and it does make it much more difficult for us to make progress because we're kind of starting from scratch every time. But we do carry over certain tendencies, and we don't lose all our gains from life to life. That's the idea of the paramis. Certainly, if we had a more extensive knowing of our past lives, and yes, I should say, maybe that would become obvious. It's like the Buddha says about how long do you want to keep filling up the cemetery. If you could have the sense of been there, done that, so strongly of having thousands and thousands of lifetimes, your lust for experience and acquisitions would not would be very hard to maintain. It would fade away. Okay, I think I'll make my exit. Thank you all for coming, and